Mike Shaft, BBC Radio Manchester.
Yes, it is 21 minutes past 7 o'clock. Now, on the eve of Holocaust Memorial Day, the Anne Frank Rose will be planted in the UK for the first time. One of the few locations it's been placed is the Manchester Jewish Museum. It will be planted on January 26th by a young refugee in recognition of the current hardships faced by people seeking asylum. Alongside that event, a theatrical production telling the extraordinary story of the Souvenir d'Anne Frank Rose is to premiere at the Zion Arts Centre. Joining us in the studio to talk about both events is Farid Vahidi, representing RAPAR, a Manchester-based human rights organisation, and Liz Mansfield, who's putting on the production at the Zion. Can I say a very good morning to you both?
Good morning, Mike. Great to be here.
Hello and very good morning to you and everyone with us at home.
Thank you very much indeed for taking time to be with us. Farid, can I start off with you? Tell us about your situation. You're from Iran, aren't you?
Well, yes, I am indeed. I'm an asylum seeker in this country right now, and I'm a RAPAR service user and membership presenter as well.
And what is RAPAR?
RAPAR stands for Refugees and Asylum Seeker Participatory Research Action. And what we do, and as we officially say, is we work together to achieve equal human rights. And what we do, we help all the displaced people all over wherever they are from, in Manchester or anywhere in the UK, as we can get onto them, to help them if we think they need any help.
Now, you're not actually planting the rose, but you'll be there supporting the event. Why do you think this is an important event?
Well, as a person who is an asylum seeker at the moment and is going through a quite hard time, I believe it's very significant how Anne Frank has gone through during those ages, because it was the World War, and then if the enemies could get to her, then she would be dead, as she ended up dead at the end of the day. And I think still for the refugees it's quite a big deal for them, that how they are being handled until they get granted asylum or not, and then the process they go through, it's actually a very, very hard and mentally activating process, which you have to be very, very...
Okay. Liz, the story of the rose is a pretty amazing one. Tell us what happened.
The rose was created in 1960 by a Belgian called Hippolyte Delforge, and it was created and grafted from two other roses. And Hippolyte wrote to Anne Frank's father, Otto Frank, who was the only member of the Frank family who survived the concentration camps. He came out of Auschwitz on Holocaust Memorial Day, which marks that event, the 27th of January 1945. Otto was delighted that this rose had been created to commemorate his daughter. So the story of the rose in Japan, which is what is at the heart of our theatre piece, went like this. A young girl called Michiko Otsuki, whose family had converted to Christianity from Shinto Buddhism, she'd suffered some, persecution and discrimination as a child, therefore related very powerfully to the story of Anne Frank when she read her diary. So Michiko wrote a letter to Otto Frank, and they began to correspond. And Christmas 1972, Otto sent Michiko a dozen rose bushes of the Souvenir d'Anne Frank rose to Japan. Now, all of these roses died except for one rose, which Michiko sent to her uncle, Mr. Yamamuru, who was a grafter of bonsai trees. And he took this one rose and he grafted it onto a Japanese wild rose, and the rose took. And Mr. Yamamuru's story is an interesting one, because he had been a biology teacher during the Second World War and had been very distressed to see his young pupils, age 15, drafted to fight. Many of them were killed during the Pacific War. Now, all these years later, as a retired person, he came to know Anne Frank's story, the story of what was their enemy on the other side of the world and her persecution. So he started to graft the rose, and he sent them to secondary schools all over Japan, where they grew and were nurtured by children as a symbol of peace, tolerance, conciliation.
How do you go about turning that awesome story into a theatre production?
We began, actually, not with that story, but with a very, very wonderful piece of music, which was a piano trio, that's piano, cello and violin, composed by a guy called Colin Deccio. It's in 7 movements. So our first idea was actually to take text from Anne Frank's diary and weave it through the music. Researching Anne's story and coming across this story, we went to Japan and researched the story further. And the idea then came to make this piece a bit more complicated and to take each movement of the trio and wind through it a different aspect of Anne's story. So in fact, our piece now begins in Japan, in a rose garden, with a young Japanese girl who is telling the story of the souvenir d'Anne Frank rose in Japan. And then we move back in time to the story of Anne Frank, to the story of her Dutch helper, Miep Gies, who supported the family when they were in hiding, to the story of Otto and his return from Auschwitz at the end of the war, and then to him sending the rose to Japan, and then we begin... We come back at the end to where we started.
Farid, I've got a very quick question to ask you. Later on in the show, we're having a debate about whether or not we could have a world without borders. What's your view?
Well, my view is, in my dreams, it would be a day that there would be a world without borders, because I believe humanity and human race should be the same and treated the same, regardless of our races or nationalities or whatever we believe in, or religions. And I think that day should come one day, and in the name of Anne Frank and everybody else who has given their lives in the line of freedom, we have to fight and then struggle and try to get that day come at eventually. Still, it doesn't seem to be very close, but we cannot give up on that day, and then we have to work for it and fight for it until the day that it comes.
Okay. Liz, you've brought in a CD. Unfortunately, we've only got a minute, so we'll try and hear as much of it as we can. What is it?
It's a song called Give, which was written by Anne Frank, and the music to it is composed by Colin Deccio.
Why is the beggar so rude? I wonder if rich people sitting at home with their good social laws and their cultural aplomb ever get round to asking themselves, why is the beggar so rude? Why is the rich man so mean? Oh, why is the rich man so mean? We're all born alike as babes, we breathe the same air.
That brings the time to exactly 7:30.